and welcome to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about J.J. Johnson, an award-winning trombonist who has repeatedly won polls for his trombone playing. The Downbeat poll, among others. Also, a Philadelphia nightclub once billed him the fastest trombone player alive. J.J. Johnson was to trombone playing what Charlie Parker was to trumpet playing. He had all the qualities of the latter, the speed, the innovation, which he wove into intricate melodies on his trombone. One of his albums, J.J. and K, proved a pivotal point in jazz trombone playing, showing that the trombone was up there with other accepted jazz instruments at the time like the keyboard, the guitar and the trumpet. By the 40s, J.J. Johnson had also become famous for his bebop style of playing, and that's when jazz trombone playing took on a new meaning. So on today's episode of the Jazz Update, it's all about J.J. Johnson, his life and times and best hits. Also coming up, some trending festival and album news. Stay tuned to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva to find out more. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. On this week's episode, we're talking about jazz icon J.J. Johnson. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about his biography. So, J.J. Johnson was one of the earliest jazz trombonists to adopt bebop as his style of play. He first started out playing the piano at age 9, then transitioned to trombone playing at age 14. He started out touring with jazz artists like Fats Navarro and Snookum Russell in the early 40s. Navarro turned out to be one of his early influencers, mentoring his trombone playing style. He started out full-time as a jazz artist playing for Benny Carter's big band in the mid-40s, with whom he made his first recording, Love for Sale, in 1943. In 1944, he took part in the Jazz at the Philharmonic concert, then joined Count Basie's orchestra in 1946. Around that time, he also began forming trios of his own. He would tour and perform with them, most notably his trio with Max Roach, Bud Powell and Sonny Stitt. He started recording with Blue Note Records in the early 50s. Some of his tracks from Blue Note Records during his early days include Walking, Enigma and Kalo. In 1954, J.J. Johnson started his famous quintet with trombonist Kay Winding. They called themselves the J and K Quintet. Their playing styles on the trombone were different, but blended very well, and their future music turned out to be a massive commercial success. They went on to tour in the US, recorded several notable albums together. They also toured internationally in the UK and Japan. One of their notable performances in later years was alongside jazz singer Sarah Vaughan on her collaboration album Sassy Swings Again. Following his stint with the J and K Quintet, Johnson began on a solo career. He would tour nationally and internationally in Scandinavia, the UK and the US, and also led some trios from time to time. Some of the players that he collaborated with during this time included saxophonists Bobby Jasper and Clifford Jordan, cornetist Nat Adderley, trumpeter Freddie Hubbard, pianist Tommy Flanagan, and more. His albums at the time reflect his unique trombone style. Notable albums released at this time include J.J.'s Broadway, The Eminent J.J. Johnson Volume 1, Blue Trombone, and more. During this time, his popularity was peaking. He went on to win Downbeat magazine polls for Best Trombone of the Year time and time again. In the 1960s, he also started composing his own music. He contributed to both classical and mainstream formats of jazz with his compositions. Many of his works were first performed at the Monterey Jazz Festivals in the 50s and the 60s. In 1961, he made a notable composition called Suite in 6 Movements, featuring Dizzy Gillespie as soloist. In 1956, he composed another brilliant piece of music, Euro Suite, which he performed alongside a jazz classical fusion orchestra in Vienna. Another beautiful piece called Diversions in 1968, performed by the American Wind Symphony Orchestra. Following his stint as a composer, he moved to Hollywood, where he began to write for cinema and TV. Some of his notable performances in Hollywood were performed alongside the Coconut Grove Orchestra of Sammy Davis Jr. and the TV Orchestra of Carol Burnett. In 1987, Johnson returned to the jazz scene with a performance at the Village Vanguard in New York City. He also began to tour nationally and internationally and released more albums. He was most active in the year 1992, where he produced a plethora of albums for Verve Records and Antilles Records, performing alongside small groups and string orchestras. Many of his albums released during this period earned him Grammy nominations. In later years, he also began to write. His books were about original exercises and etudes for aspiring jazz musicians. In 1995, he was voted into the Downbeat Hall of Fame. He died in 2001, leaving behind a legacy as one of the greatest jazz trombonists in jazz. J.J. Johnson showed that the trombone could be played as a bebop instrument. So that was a bit about J.J. Johnson's biography, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua De Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon J.J. Johnson. Now it's time to talk about some trending album news. There's a live album release called A Night at the Symphony featuring rising jazz artist Loive's live tour at the Harper Concert Hall. It's now trending on the top of the Billboard Jazz charts. So the Harper Concert Hall is a famous concert hall in Iceland. So she basically held this concert to promote her up-and-coming album Everything I Know About Love. The tickets soon sold out, and the concert went down as one of her best live performances. An album compilation of her performances at that concert is now trending on the charts. It's called A Night at the Symphony, comprises 14 tracks. So this album basically features renditions of jazz classics like Cole Porter's Every Time We Say Goodbye, Hoagy Carmichael and Ned Washington's The Nearness of You, and more. One of the songs, Valentine, peaked at the top of the Spotify jazz charts when the album was released August last year. So basically, this album showcases Loive's love of jazz classics. Also, she's currently working on another album that is set to be released later this year. So that was some trending album news right there, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about some of J.J. Johnson's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon J.J. Johnson, and on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of some of the albums we are going to be talking about. The first album is called Trombone by Three. This album is a great example of Johnson's trombone playing from the bebop era. Another trombone favorite, Blue Trombone. This one's an early example of hard bop, and it's a great album that showcases Johnson's early days in trombone. It comprises a mixture of classics and J.J. Johnson originals. The next album is called The Brass Orchestra. In this album, J.J. is at the helm of a brass orchestra combining French horns, tubas, harps, and more. The results perfectly supplement his trombone playing, giving them a unique sound by contrast. Another album, Standards, live at the Village Vanguard. This one's a great album taken from one of his band's live performances at the Village Vanguard in New York City. They performed renditions of 9 jazz classics on this album. So that was a quick recap of some of the albums we are going to be talking about on this hour. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We'll be right back after some music. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon J.J. Johnson. And on this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Trombone by Three. This one was released in 1925. This album is a great example of Johnson's trombone playing from the bebop era. It showcases him alongside Kay Winding and Bernie Green. The title track kickstarts the music, with Johnson showcasing some of his Charlie Parker bop style playing on the trombone. He then works his way up some rapid-paced tracks like Fox Hunt and Opus V. He's joined by tenor saxophonist Sonny Rollins, trumpeter Kenny Dorham, pianist John Lewis, and drummer Max Roach on these tracks. There's also some fine solo performance by other band members, Lewis and Dorham. There's also an original song by Kay Winding called A Night on Bob Mountain. Roy Haynes on drums is one of the highlights of this album with his bass drum rhythms. Now, Johnson and Winding were more acclimatized towards a bebop style, but Benny Green adopts a more swinging R&B style with his trombone playing. One highlight from Benny Green, his duet with Eddie Davis on saxophone on the track Pennies from Heaven. Another trombone favorite, Blue Trombone, released in 1957. This one's an early example of hard bop, and it's a great album that showcases Johnson's early trombone playing. Comprises a mixture of classics and J.J. originals. Some of the tracks from this album, Hello Young Lovers and Gone with the Wind. Blue Trombone is an original composition, and J.J. is backed on this album by pianist Tommy Flanagan, bassist Paul Chambers, and drummer Max Roach. The next album is called The Brass Orchestra, released in 1997. In this album, J.J. is at the helm of a brass orchestra, combining French horns, tubas, harps, and more. The results perfectly supplement his trombone playing, giving them a unique sound by contrast. The album comprises straight-ahead jazz melodies and also some jazz classics, songs like Canon for Bella and Comfort Zone. He also plays some of his early compositions from the 50s and the 60s, songs like Horn for Plenty, Poem for Brass, and Ballad for Joe. His trombone solos are also noteworthy, swinging and imaginative. Another album from 1988, Standards, live at the Village Vanguard. This was the second album from Johnson's Village Vanguard performances. The Village Vanguard was a favorite jazz haunt in New York City. The first album of the sort is called Quintergy. On this album, Johnson's quintet pairs up with Ralph Moore on tenor saxophone and soprano, pianist Stanley Cowell, bassist Rufus Reed, and drummer Victor Lewis. They performed renditions of 9 jazz classics on this album. Some of the highlights of this album, Autumn Leaves, Mysterioso, and Just Friends. The opening track, CC Riders, is the entire band performing very energetically. So overall, 2 JJ originals and 8 jazz classics. Most of them are rapid-paced tracks except for the ballads Misty and My Funny Valentine. So this one's a great album from a live jazz performance. So that was a quick recap of some of J.J. Johnson's best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break, be right back after that. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. On this week's episode, it's all about the life and times and best hits of jazz icon J.J. Johnson, and now we're going to be talking about some new albums that have been released this week. There's a new album from Jose James called 1978. Jose James is primarily a hip-hop and neo-soul artist, but he's expanding his horizons to jazz music in this album. This album is dedicated to his birth year, 1978, features a blend of 70s funk and disco in his own jazz renditions. So this album is available for $30 on bandcamp.com. Another album called Run Your Race by Candace Springs. This one's a tribute album by Candace to her father, athletic icon and musician Kenneth Springs. It's a deep and personal album full of nostalgic tracks that are all about motivation. For more information, please visit www.candacesprings.com. And an album called Perceive Its Beauty, Acknowledge Its Grace. This one's by jazz artist Shabaka Hutchins. It's also his debut album on the Impulse label. Shabaka Hutchins has been a sideman and band leader for several years, performing nationally and internationally. This album's theme is saxophone, wind and flute instruments. For more information, please visit shabakahutchins.com. So that was some news about some trending albums that have just been released, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashani Silva. We're going for a short break, be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of J.J. Johnson's best albums of all time. Stay tuned.